Welcome to episode number 16. I'm CJ Werleman. Thank you for joining us. This week we examine the great American betrayal of the Afghan people and the refugee and humanitarian crisis it will now choose to ignore. But first, a quick reminder to hit the subscribe button below so you don't miss out on any future episodes. Now let's get into it. Look, there's hardly anything more American than putting in place a corrupt puppet regime, but only later to betray that exact same regime by negotiating an exit out of the country with the enemy of said regime, which is exactly what the United States government has done in Afghanistan. This betrayal coming after the US invested a whopping $2.2 trillion in the country. But if you're wondering why this huge amount of treasure did not produce peace and prosperity, it's because rather than use this money to build the country's democratic institutions, haul in government corruption, and invest in critical infrastructure and social welfare programs, most of this cash was spent on counter-terrorism operations. And if we've learned anything during the past 20 years of the war on terror, it's that counter-terrorism operations serve only to prolong conflict and suffering if, and I do mean only if, the socio-economic political drivers that help make the terrorist group appealing to the local population are not addressed. But it's now too late to change all of that. That horse has bolted. The US has once again been forced to recognize that you can't win the hearts and minds of a people that you're bombing and occupying. And they certainly aren't going to lend their hearts and minds to a puppet regime that plays host to a widely unpopular foreign occupying power. So the Taliban are here to stay, and with far greater military power than they possessed 20 years ago, having secured billions of dollars worth of US weapons, Humvees and combat helicopters left on the battlefield by retreating US and Afghan forces. For the first time in its history, the Taliban will have an air force. But the UK government and its Western allies, including the United Kingdom and Australia, would dearly love this to be the end of the story, with our failures in Afghanistan conveniently scrubbed clean from our collective memories. But sorry, it doesn't work like that. Video images of terrified and panicked Afghan civilians falling to their deaths from the cargo doors and landing gears of US military aircraft will haunt the US and its allies for years. Likewise, the world will not forget how US Marines reportedly shot and killed panicked Afghans on the tarmac of Kabul's international airport as they made their desperate attempt for an outbound flight. It should go without saying that the US and its Western allies now have a moral obligation to save Afghan lives by resolving the unfolding refugee and humanitarian crisis. And I'm not only referring to those fleeing the Taliban, but the millions of Afghan people who have been displaced by almost 4 decades of non-stop war. But as it stands, Western countries, and I mean those that have contributed to the bloodshed and displacement, are willing to accept only a tiny minority of refugees and only a small number of those they hired to help perform their jobs and duties while they occupied the country. Surely there's a special place in hell for countries that create refugee crises in Muslim majority countries but then refuse to accept refugees from said Muslim majority countries. I mean, take the United States for instance. Its military and diplomatic operations in the country depended upon the help it received from tens of thousands of Afghan workers, including translators, administrative officers, cleaners, drivers, you name it. I mean, the US employed 20,000 Afghan translators alone, but has evacuated only 1,200 of them under its special immigrant visa program, with stated aims to evacuate only a further 3,500 in coming weeks, which leaves roughly 15,000 at the mercy of the Taliban, which has promised to imprison and/or execute anybody who assisted the US and Kabul regime. So what about my home country, Australia? It too depended upon thousands of Afghan workers, but so far has offered visas to fewer than 400, while cutting the total number of refugees it's willing to accept in half, which constitutes a shameless shirking of moral responsibility and represents a fraction of the 20,000 Afghan refugees that human rights advocates have urged Australia to accept. Diplomats, journalists, NGOs and human rights activists who are on the ground describe the frantic desperation of those seeking a way out of the country as women and men of military age desperately scrub their cell phones of music, photographs and other items that could make them a target for arrest and execution. Make no mistake, the Taliban will hunt down and kill everyone on its list of enemies. Eventually, these are the people the US and its allies have betrayed. I mean, look at this turtle creep. He doesn't give a single damn about human life, particularly so Muslims. His only immoral concern is in locking Afghan refugees out of France. And at the same time these Western governments are refusing to accept an adequate number of refugees, they're also pressuring Muslim majority countries to carry the burden. But what these governments don't mention is that Muslim majority countries, Pakistan, Iran and Turkey, have already taken the lion's share of Afghanistan's 2.6 million refugees. In fact, of the 10 countries that host the greatest number of refugees, 7 are Muslim majority countries. Clearly, these nations are doing the heavy lifting. And they're doing this heavy lifting despite an overwhelming majority of the world's total refugee population being displaced in wars that were led by or involved Western countries. I mean, here's the ambassador of Pakistan to Afghanistan offering refuge to Afghan journalists and their families. But unlike the United States, Pakistan never invaded, occupied, or even bombed Afghanistan. So clearly, the countries that did invade, occupy, and bomb the country have a moral obligation to follow Pakistan's lead and do something meaningful to alleviate the suffering endured by displaced Afghans. Okay, sure, admittedly, Canada deserves honourable mention for raising its intake of Afghan refugees to 20,000 this week. But ultimately, these mostly symbolic efforts do little to alleviate the country's refugee crisis, remembering that of the world's 25 million refugee population, 1 in 10 are Afghans, making them the second largest refugee population after Syrians. And while we're on the subject of Syria for a moment, it's also important to recognise the way in which the Iranian regime has exploited Shia Afghan refugees by forcing them into sectarian militias to support the Assad regime. Iranian commanders call these Afghan recruits cannon fodder and human shields because they're used to carry out near suicidal missions against anti-Assad forces and to protect actual Iranian units from incoming fire. Worryingly, with large numbers of Afghans making their way towards the Iranian border, it's likely more Afghan refugees will be forced against their will to kill Syrian refugees in Idlib province, where the Assad regime is carrying out a renewed offensive. If that horrific prospect doesn't ring yet another alarm bell to this unfolding humanitarian catastrophe, then I don't know what more to tell you. Oh wait, there is plenty more to tell you. You see, despite these horrific realities, Western governments have shown callous disregard for Afghan refugees throughout the past 2 decades. European countries are guilty of deporting Afghan refugees back to Afghanistan, where they face certain persecution and death, either from the Taliban, ethnic militias, or despotic warlords. In fact, European countries rejected 9,500 asylum applications and deported all of them to Afghanistan during 2016 alone. The fate of his people remains unknown today. And let's not forget about Australia here, which not only refused to take in refugees from Muslim countries that it bombed, including Afghanistan, Iraq and Syria, but then also built a chain of concentration camps on remote South Pacific islands where it kept thousands of refugees incarcerated for years. Many of these refugees were journalists, lawyers, doctors, and even poets, including Behrooz Boochani, who isn't even a Muslim, but a Kurdish-Iranian journalist and film producer. When I spoke to him in 2019, he explained to me how conditions were so miserable that some of his fellow detainees committed suicide by setting themselves on fire. He said to me, and I quote, "When you keep innocent people in indefinite detention for 6 years and deprive them of medical treatment, it's natural for people to lose hope and then choose to harm themselves." End quote. Clearly, Australia and other wealthy Western countries, particularly those that have contributed to the protraction of armed conflict in Afghanistan, must do more and can do more to save Afghan lives. That said, the United Nations also has a moral duty of care here too, and it has urged member states to contribute to the severely underfunded humanitarian appeal for Afghanistan, which right now has fulfilled only 30% of its funding needs. More importantly, Western governments must resist the urge to do what it is they always do to governments they don't like, and that's impose crippling economic sanctions on Afghanistan, which will only further punish ordinary Afghan civilians. In other words, Western governments need to accept the Taliban has won and then work with the UN to hold the country's war criminals accountable on both sides of the conflict, while at the same time providing humanitarian aid and assistance to the Afghan people. God knows they have already suffered enough. Anyway, that's all we have time for this week. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please like and subscribe to this channel and help spread the word with your family and friends on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. And please consider supporting this endeavor by becoming a member of this show at patreon.com/CJWellerman. We all need all the help we can get. But for now, good night, good morning, or good day, wherever you are, and stay blessed.